Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and I'm an apostate. The other day, I was in a TikTok live with one of my mutuals, Jaytheist, and the subject of contradictions in the Bible came up. When Christians in the audience asked for examples, Jay and I talked about the contradictions in the gospel narratives. One of the audience members cited a video, and I said that I would look into it. Turns out said video is a 2-year-old video made by this creator, Testify. And it seems as though he is responding to a book written by Dr. Bart Erhman called Jesus Interrupted. When I found out that Testify is arguing against Bart Ehrman's book, I paused the video and went and bought it to make sure that I was prepared for what it was exactly that Testify was arguing against. In that same spirit, I feel like it's necessary for us to first break down Bart's argument in this section that Testify is responding to before we really get into Testify's arguments against it. Before listing the contradictions among the resurrection narratives, Bart gives some important background information regarding the Gospels. 1. We don't have any of the originals of any of these Gospels. Only copies made later, in most instances, many centuries later. These copies all differ from one another, very often in the accounts of Jesus' resurrection. Scholars have to determine what the original said on the basis of these later manuscripts. In some places, the decisions are quite straightforward. In others, there is a lot of debate. One aspect of the resurrection narratives there is little debate. The final 12 verses of Mark's Gospel are not original, but were added by a scribe in a later generation. Mark ended his Gospel at what is now chapter 16, verse 8. Now we go to the resurrection contradictions that Bart briefly mentions in his book. Who went to the tomb? Mary Magdalene alone? Mary and another Mary? Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome? Or women who had accompanied Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem? Possibly Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women? Had the stone been rolled away from the tomb, or was it rolled away by an angel while the women were there? Whom or what did they see there? An angel? A young man? Two men? Or nothing and no one? What were they told? Tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee? Or to remember what Jesus told them while he was in Galilee, that he had to die and rise again? Do the women tell the disciples what they saw and heard, or do they not tell anyone? If they tell someone, whom do they tell? The 11 disciples? The 11 disciples and some other people? Simon Peter and another unnamed disciple? What do the disciples do in response? Nothing, because Jesus immediately appears to them? Not believe the women? Go to the tomb to see for themselves? Bart states that the one thing that all the Gospels can agree is that on the third day after Jesus was buried, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and finds it empty. On virtually every other detail, the Gospels disagree. Then emphasizes on what he thinks is the most irreconcilable discrepancy, namely, how the disciples respond to the resurrection. So in Mark, women are instructed to tell the disciples to go meet Jesus in Galilee, but out of fear, they don't say a word about it. In Matthew, the disciples are told to meet Jesus in Galilee and immediately do so. Jesus appears to them and gives them their final instruction. In Luke, disciples remain in Jerusalem until Jesus tells them to meet him at Bethany, where he gives his instruction and ascends to heaven. In Acts, disciples remain in Jerusalem until Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. Here we see a map of Israel in the New Testament. For reference, here is Jerusalem, and and here's Bethany. And all the way up here is Galilee. That is a distance of around 120 miles. So Bart says, and so the discrepancy. If Matthew is right, that the disciples immediately go to Galilee and see Jesus ascend from there, how can Luke be right that the disciples stay in Jerusalem the whole time, see Jesus ascend from there, and stay until Pentecost? And now I'll be examining the counter-arguments that Testify presents in his video.
There's nothing wrong with appealing to expert authorities. Fancy credentials can't cover up weak arguments.
Alright, this is one thing that we can agree on. This is the appealing to authority fallacy. In other words, just because someone is an authority does not mean that they are right. You need to examine their arguments and the evidence that they bring.
Enter Bart Erhman.
Bart Erhman, everyone's favorite. Bart Erhman, Christian who became an agnostic, textual critic. Bart Erhman.
Dr. Erhman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's written several scholarly and popular level works that cast doubt on the reliability of the New Testament. As an agnostic, one reason Erhman says that we should reject the resurrection of Jesus is that the gospel narratives are hopelessly contradictory.
Now I'm starting to see some red flags. While Testify accurately lists off Bart Ehrman's expertise, his certifications and degrees, as well as his accomplishments, he does not characterize Bart Ehrman's critique as a scholar, but as an agnostic who seems to be bent on convincing others to adopt his unbelief. Bart has repeatedly stated that he does not believe that the contradictions in the Bible are a valid reason for someone to disbelieve.
Many people think that if the Bible's not completely accurate, then there's no reason to be a Christian. I think that's crazy, personally. And I just think it's crazy. I don't know why I do know why. I do know why so many people believe it, but I think it's wrong. But it's a reality that many people do feel that way. And if that's how you feel, if that's your belief, then once you're shown problems in the Bible, just the whole thing goes away. That's not what happened with me, but it does happen because people don't realize that Christianity historically has not been a religion that is about the Bible. It's about Christ. And the Bible is important to Christianity, has always been important to Christianity, but it's never been the object of faith. It's not supposed to be the object of faith. And if it is the object of faith, that's idolatry within Christianity. And so the idea that you've got to believe in the Bible, that's just a modern form of Christian idolatry, as far as I'm concerned. But since so many people have that view, that when they realize, oh my God, there are contradictions. Oh, there are mistakes. Well, I guess I can't be a Christian anymore. As if if Genesis 1 contradicts Genesis 2, then somehow Christ cannot reveal God. What? What? It doesn't make any sense, but it's just what people have heard. And so that's what they think.
Ehrman even states here in this book that convincing others to leave Christianity is not his goal. In Jesus Interrupted, Bart writes, "Some readers will find it surprising that I do not see the material in the preceding chapters as an attack on Christianity, or an agnostic's attempt to show that faith, even Christian faith, is meaningless and absurd. That is not what I think, and is not what I have been trying to accomplish. I have been trying, instead, to make serious scholarship on the Bible and the earliest Christianity accessible and available to people who may be interested in the New Testament, but who, for one reason or another, have never heard what scholars have long known and thought about it." Despite ascribing the phrase hopelessly contradictory to Bart Ehrman, I cannot find Bart using this phrase anywhere in this book. What Bart does say is that the gospel accounts are full of differences and discrepancies, and that some of these are irreconcilable. If Testify misrepresents Bart this badly in his introduction, I'm kind of worried to see what we are in store for. But maybe he's more fair in his breakdown. Let's continue.
Bart says the Gospels are in conflict regarding how many women were present at Jesus' tomb. Who actually went to the tomb? Was it Mary alone, as we see in John 21? Now, if we did stop at the first verse of John 20, then Mary does seem to be alone. But as a little common sense will tell you, you can't just read one Bible verse. You have to look at the whole context, so let's continue to read. Here's what we see in John 22. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they laid him.
And Testify finishes his argument about John chapter 20 here, strongly implying that because John describes Mary speaking in the plural about those who are searching for Jesus' body, that must mean that plurality of people were at the tomb. But this simply doesn't follow. Just because there are multiple people searching for the body does not mean that there were multiple people at the tomb. Now, that being said, I'm willing to tentatively accept the possibility of John envisioning more than just Mary at the tomb, not because of this one verse, but because other scholars have suggested that John is using other Gospels to create his own. Granted, this is disputed by other scholars. But even if we grant that the author of John envisions multiple people at the tomb with Mary, it does not change the fact that he describes only Mary at the tomb. This is clearly still a difference between the other Gospels. And we do not know the identity or the number of the other people that are with Mary, assuming that John is envisioning multiple people with Mary, which, once again, we do not know.
But Bart still sees contradictions here when he asks Mary and another Mary, Matthew 28:1, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, as in Mark 16:1, or women who accompanied Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, possibly Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women, see Luke 24:1. But here's the thing, neither Matthew nor Mark claims to have a complete list.
Sure, but besides Luke, none of them claim to have incomplete lists either. And unlike John, we don't have any evidence within the text that support the idea that Matthew and Mark have incomplete lists. Without said evidence, it is just pure speculation.
Bart's problem is that he seems to think that the gospel writers are trying to give us every detail about every event. If we assume that, then differences can be seen as contradictions.
No, the problem is, Testify, that you have forgotten or are ignoring Bart's stated goal in this book, and that is to point out that these differences exist. Whether or not they can be reconciled is completely irrelevant to that goal.
But since when do two accounts need to be perfectly identical for them both to be true? We don't apply this reasoning in the courts of law. 19th century legal expert Thomas Starkey writes, "It so rarely happens that witnesses of the same transaction perfectly and entirely agree in all points connected with it, that an entire and complete coincidence in every particular, so far from strengthening their credit, not infrequently engenders a suspicion of practice in concert."
Okay, note again Bart Erhman's goal is not to refute the reliability of the gospel accounts. It is instead to point out that these differences exist. Here, Testify is conceding that these differences exist, but is attempting to spin it as a strength of them being eyewitness accounts. But of course, there's one huge problem with that, and that is that the scholarly consensus is that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts.
Hey everybody, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written anonymously and almost certainly not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of the Gospels actually explicitly names their authors. The closest we get is the Gospel of John, saying that the beloved disciple was the one who wrote these things. But the very next statement is, we know that his testimony is true. We also have the author speaking in the first person plural in the first chapter on two different occasions. And so most likely the Gospel of John was written by a group of people whose primary source was a narrative account written by someone they identified as the beloved disciple, who was later identified as the Apostle John. Now, the first person to actually assign traditional authorship to the four Gospels as we know them today was Irenaeus of Lyons, who was writing around 180 CE, so a full century or more after the composition of the Gospels. The four authors of the Gospels in our New Testament are almost certainly not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were written anonymously, and we will never know who wrote them.
Also in Jesus Interrupted, Bart writes, "One point in particular seems to be irreconcilable."
Oh good, looks like Testify is about ready to dig into the contradiction that Bart considers the most irreconcilable. Let's see what he has to say.
In Mark's account, the women are instructed to tell the disciples to go meet Jesus in Galilee, but out of fear they don't say a word to anyone about it. So in Matthew and Luke, the women tell disciples what happened, but Mark says they said nothing to anyone. But is that really the right way to read Mark? If you have a modern translation of the Bible, you'll notice that Mark 16:9 through 20 was not part of the original text. But there's scholarly debate about whether verse 8 is where Mark meant to end his gospel. Dr. Bruce Metzger of Princeton Seminary believed that the original conclusion was lost. And plot twist, Metzger directed Erhman's doctoral dissertation, and they even co-authored a book together. So Erhman probably knows all of the scholarly debate, but for one reason or another, he just doesn't tell us about it.
Well, Testify here is claiming that Bart is lying about what the scholars are saying about Mark. Well, let's see what Bart actually said in his book. Bart writes, "In one aspect of the resurrection narratives, there is little debate. It appears that the final 12 verses of Mark's Gospel are not original to Mark's Gospel, but were added by a scribe in a later generation. Mark ended his Gospel at what is now 16:8, with the women fleeing the tomb and not telling anyone what they had seen. In my discussion, I accept the scholarly consensus that verses 9 through 21 were a later addition to the Gospel. It is important to note that scholarly consensus does not mean that there are no dissenting opinions among scholars. It simply means that the vast majority of relevant scholars are in agreement on an issue. Even if Metzger was in disagreement with Bart here, it does not change the fact that the majority of scholars are in agreement that Mark ends at 16:8. Now, I would get into Metzger's argument, but Testify doesn't provide a source for it anywhere, not in this video, nor in the description under it. In searching for a source, I did find this excerpt from Bruce Metzger. Today we know that the last 12 verses of the Gospel according to Mark are absent from the oldest Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Armenian manuscripts, and that in other manuscripts, asterisks or obli mark the verses as doubtful or spurious. External and internal evidence is conclusive against the authenticity of the last 12 verses as coming from the same pen as the rest of the Gospel. So even the very scholar that Testify cites as proof that Bart is lying agrees with Bart that the scholarly consensus is that Mark ends on 16:8. Well, maybe we can finally get to where Testify addresses the clear contradiction that Bart brings up between Mark and Matthew.
That's strike 2 for Erhman.
Or not. Wait, so Testify, rather than dealing with the discrepancy between Matthew and Luke that Bart characterizes as the most irreconcilable difference, goes off on a tangent about how Bart is lying and cites a scholar, well, actually fails to cite a scholar, who actually agrees with him.
In Jesus Interrupted, Bart says, "On the third day after Jesus' death, the women go to the tomb and anoint his body for burial. And whom do they see there? Do they see a man, as Mark says? Or two men, as Luke says? Or an angel, as we read in Matthew?" But hang on a second, we know from multiple passages that angels often appear as men in the Old Testament. This just isn't all that difficult.
Well, it's refreshing to see that this is at least one other area where me and Testify agree. This seems to be a very minute difference.
So what about the number of angels? Well, logically speaking, wherever two angels are, there's always at least one. Matthew and Mark focus on the one who spoke. No account says there was one angel and no other.
And he lost me. Matthew and Mark state that there is only one man or angel. Luke has two. John has none. These are differences and discrepancies that exist, no matter what scenario Testify fabricates in order to harmonize them.
For Bart, the resurrection accounts aren't hopelessly contradictory. While there are other alleged discrepancies in the resurrection accounts, we've seen that Erhman has viewed differences as contradictions, he's rejected sensible harmonization, and he hasn't given us the full picture of the scholarly debate. The other differences don't really fare all that better.
Please note what Testify is doing here. He is dismissing Bart and consensus scholarship and giving his audience permission to do the same by claiming that he has supposedly exposed Bart as either a biased scholar or at worst intentionally dishonest. But as we have seen, Testify has repeatedly mischaracterized Bart's intentions and arguments throughout this video, going so far as falsely accusing Bart of lying about the scholarly debate on Mark. Testify chose to cherry-pick 2 of the 7 discrepancies that Bart brought up in his book, and he doesn't even address the one that Bart considers the most irreconcilable. It should be obvious to anyone with sense that Testify had no intention of honestly engaging Bart's arguments in this video. Instead, he has knocked over a straw man of his own creation, with the clear goal of making his audience comfortable with sitting in their ignorance and ignoring the scholarship that Bart has labored to make readily available to everyone. Unfortunately, it seems that his disingenuous tactics are working, considering 2 years later, someone is citing this video.
But here's the lesson. The letters behind someone's name don't mean anything without evidence to back up their position. Always ask yourself, why should I believe this person's opinion? Sometimes a scholar is in a good spot to give us her judgment. But all appeals to authority ultimately rest on the evidence that the scholar has. Do your own research and don't be intimidated.
And this video's reminder that just because someone tickles your confirmation bias doesn't excuse you from doing the legwork of doing the research yourself.